Hey there, fellow DPS player. Well, I say fellow, but I must admit I tend to main a healer. But that doesn't mean I haven't dipped my toes into the lava pool that is DPS. In this video, I'll be going over all of the professions and their elite specializations that provide a clear and strong DPS option. This video will be going over the mechanics of each and their respective styles, without putting too much weight on the numbers as, for one, there are so many specs that bring a clear damage path, and two, this is a live service game where the balance can change frequently. Also to note, with the intense customization of the game, you can make any spec into a serviceable damage dealer, but for the sake of a beginner-friendly starting point, some elite specs might not be shown in great detail, as they are perhaps more healing/support focused. For example, some of the elite specs in my previous video, choosing a healer, may not be covered in depth here. Go check that one out if you are interested in healers. Now, this is not to say that it's impossible to flex into damage, but to just keep it more clear and understandable as a starting point, some may be more neglected than others. First, let's start with the Guardian. The Guardian's damage elite specializations involve the Dragon Hunter, the Firebrand, and the Willbender. Let's begin with the Dragon Hunter. The Dragon Hunter focuses on ranged combat by gaining access to the longbow. The longbow excels at single target damage and area damage with their arrows piercing targets in a line. They gain access to traps, which have a higher chance of proccing in melee, but can be used more defensively while luring enemies into them. The traits are more so straightforward and very approachable, without muddying the waters too much in terms of what the Dragon Hunter seeks to accomplish. Big DPS. It's currently a bit weak, and I said I wasn't going to mention numbers because things can change. However, I think it is important to note that with the Dragon Hunter specifically, it's only really bringing this damage, and so it would be nice to see that the damage is perhaps performing higher, as it does not provide the major aggressive DPS boon of quickness, nor does it share out many stacks of might or even fury. So, to note, if a spec is going into pure DPS, I think it's nice to continue to promote it being a stronger damage dealer. Next, let's talk about Firebrand. The Firebrand focuses on melee and mid-ranged combat with their weapon of the axe. The Firebrand provides high condition damage uptime through its burning and bleeding application. It's able to weave in quickness naturally into its combat flow, making it extremely valuable. And it has decent access to self-defense if you find yourself in a sticky situation. Combined with the flexible tomes and mantras, Firebrands are able to answer many problems. And next we have the Willbender. Willbenders focus on fast-paced melee combat through their offhand sword and add more physicality to the Guardian. Willbenders are extremely quick and gain more benefit from hitting multiple strikes in quick succession. They can provide alacrity, but it can only really be applied in group scenarios when you're taking an entirely separate trait line. Alacrity sharing feels more so strange, but the self-alacrity that is available through the Willbender traits is pretty good. It's implemented well enough to the point where it's kind of useful to take alacrity sometimes, but it could have a longer duration. Additionally, I kind of think that quickness would probably serve Willbender a little bit more, as it would allow your auto attacks to chain faster and proccing more of that passive virtue effect, especially when you consider that the activation of your F1 through F3 abilities is only a limited duration, so you want to make sure that you're hitting your attacks quite quickly. Wrapping up the Guardian's options, the Dragon Hunter provides nice, long-ranged combat, Firebrand with mid to close-range condition damage, and the Willbender also providing really nice, fast-paced melee strike damage, as well as condition damage. Next up, let's talk about the Warrior. The elite specializations we'll cover include the Berserker, Spellbreaker, and the Bladesworn. For Berserkers, they have many tools at their disposal. You can take the road of strike or condition damage if you please. Building up adrenaline allows you to go berserk, increasing your power and becoming a fiery flurry of attacks. The torch is granted to the warrior and acts as a bolstering of their condition damage. Quickness is accessible to the entirety of the warrior, but if it was buffed perhaps in the damaging elite specs, of course, like Berserker, via traits or other means, it might make it more smooth in terms of its gameplay, like Firebrand is. Next up, Spellbreaker. Spellbreakers have the potential for damage, but usually focus more on tank or bruisery playstyles, with crowd control stuns and applying effects to enemies to weaken them. Dual-wielding daggers grants the Spellbreaker skills to get close to their target to control them, and then deal increased damage to those controlled foes. With recent updates, Spellbreakers are able to more organically share might to allies if need be. Overall, Spellbreaker is a fun elite spec, but feels like it's more so majoring in that bruiser tank role, while providing more of a minor in DPS, but not entirely impossible. That leads us to the Bladesworn. Like Berserker, Bladesworns focus on bringing the big damage. However, Bladesworns seek to deal their damage through a different mindset. They will kneel down for a longer duration while preparing a huge burst of damage. This is achieved through its Dragon Trigger skill. On top of its Dragon Trigger mechanic, these warriors gain access to a new weapon through their F1, the Gunblade. This Gunblade weapon offers explosive attacks which hold multiple charges. These attacks offer access to strong melee momentum and a few skills that can reach enemies at range and even close gaps. This elite spec has a few utility skills that increase their damage and reset their skills and ammunitions, allowing for more uptime on their damage. And for the final heavy armor profession, we have the Revenant. We'll talk about the Renegade and the Vindicator. But of course, the Herald was mentioned in my previous video and can be built with more DPS in mind. Focusing on the Renegade is a shortbow-wielding spirit summoner. This elite spec prioritizes condition damage through the shortbow, and the Kala's warband spirits are able to apply conditions and enhance allies to allow them to bleed foes or siphon life. The profession updates juggle a couple different mechanics: Kala's Fervor and Citadel Orders. Kala's Fervor is a mechanic you can mostly forget about, as it's gained from critically hitting and striking enemies from the side or behind, and you'll usually stay at the maximum 5 stacks throughout combat, increasing your damage. The Citadel Orders consist of 2 buffing skills and 1 attack skill that summons a flurry of burning missiles. These can be useful, but the strongest one is Orders from Above, which shares Alacrity. And considering the bulk of Renegade is quite aggressive, to keep my reasoning in line, it would be nice if this was also Quickness instead of Alacrity. Maybe. But it is what it is. Next up, Vindicator. Vindicators are able to focus on a DPS playstyle by camping in the Alliance stance of Arcamoris. This side of the Alliance provides leaps, stuns, and utility skills that grant the Vindicator a healthy amount of DPS boons, including Might, Fury, and Quickness. The Grandmaster trait, Forerunner of Death, allows the dodge to deal great amounts of damage, and grant them a personal DPS buff. The Vindicator has modest DPS, but could hit a bit harder considering that it doesn't share Quickness, in line with the Dragon Hunter as I previously mentioned. If it's not providing these boons, then it really should be capitalizing on the DPS that it can bring itself. Moving swiftly on over to the medium armors, we're going to start with Ranger, which we will talk about the Soul Beast and the Untamed. Mixing both strike damage and condition damage, Soul Beasts are flexible damage dealers. The Soul Beast learns to use the main hand dagger, empowering its condition damage playstyle. Beast mode is the profession mechanic and increases pet importance. This makes the pet a more dynamic mechanic, fusing into the player character and defusing to return as its own AI pet. The stance skills granted to this elite specialization bring a host of unique buffs for the Soul Beast, and when traded, these effects can be shared to allies. And while Soul Beast isn't providing that quickness, it is somewhat useful as it can provide these extremely unique buffs of reduced damage, might generation on attacks, and even additional strikes. The Untamed is a hulking brawler who excels at crowd control effects and taking advantage of the space they create. With the hammer as their new weapon and the unleashed profession mechanic, they are able to swap modes of crowd control and higher damage. Swapping modes also affects your pet abilities. While your pet is unleashed, they gain 3 new skills, allowing them to reach targets faster and control them with various effects. The new utility category is of cantrips. These skills give great utility to the Untamed through teleports, knockdowns, creating areas of control, and self-buffs which reduce all the damage they would receive by half. Much like the Spellbreaker, the Untamed looks to focus more on a tank/bruiser playstyle, but it's surprisingly proficient with its damage. And I thought I mentioned this towards the end. Soul Beast and Untamed do have the ability to grant alacrity due to general ranger changes. However, it just feels somewhat limiting as it's only on the spirits. But regardless, Soul Beast offers a nice mixture of strike and condition damage with being very fast. And Untamed is equally as fast, I would say, but sometimes focuses more on the crowd control elements of combat. Next, the Thief. The Thief has access to Daredevil, Deadeye, and a little bit of Spectre for condition damage. Starting with the Daredevils, Daredevils are highly mobile melee fighters who wield a melee staff. Their mobility is also an extension of their attacks. Gaining 3 dodges, Daredevils are able to leap and land in an area of damage, or spin while throwing a flurry of daggers. Gaining physical skills increases their pressure in melee combat. They are able to block attacks to prepare a kick, throw daggers to interrupt enemy actions, send a flurry of daggers to pump out conditions, and their elite skill is even able to immediately kill an enemy in competitive modes. Daredevils don't have access to group quickness, so once again, their damage should be more prioritized. And Deadeyes. From a great distance, Deadeyes are proficient at executing targets from their sniping nest. Deadeyes gain access to the rifle, which has a unique function of positioning the thief in a crouching pose. While kneeling, they are able to only dodge to move. However, their attacks gain extended range and power. Cantrips are the new utility category for thieves and allow them to quickly affect a target or area. Their elite skill is also able to remove Reveal and then immediately stealth the Deadeye, guaranteeing a successful stealth. Once again, neither Daredevil or Deadeye have access to group quickness, so they have to rely on their own damage potential to find a place in a group. An update to add a bit of quickness to one of these elite specs at least would be a nice update. If it already is, then maybe I was a psychic and I influenced change. Nevertheless, moving on to Spectre. While I had Spectre in the healer video, and it is highly focused on that, they do have a minor focus on condition damage with their Scepter and Well skills, along with their Shadow Shroud. There are only a couple traits that improve condition damage, but I thought I might as well mention it here. Engineers. Engineers can play around with all 3 elite specs, honestly. Scrapper, Hollowsmith, and Mechanist. Scrappers are phenomenal bruisers with equal parts sustain and damage. Gaining access to the hammer, Scrappers become melee-focused damage dealers, equipped with a lot of utility with their friendly and deadly gyros. Their traits reward the Scrapper for upkeeping stability and controlling a target with CC skills. In addition to all of their damage, Scrappers bolster their defenses with Barrier and can take traits which delay the damage they receive from enemies. Hollowsmiths, equipped with the Photon Forge, are masters of hard light, constructing weapons made of energy harnessed from the desert heat and sun. Hollowsmiths come with a flurry of attacks and a few defensive tricks up their sleeves to make sure that they don't fold in combat. These engineers also gain the main hand sword, which empowers their melee attacks and grant them personal quickness. Hollowsmith is a bit more straightforward in its DPS. It's not looking to do much else, bringing that big, chunky damage. Mechanists. Alongside their intense healing and support capabilities, Mechanists come loaded with a variety of damage playstyles. The mech can be configured to be a melee fighter that applies condition damage, or a ranged fighter that focuses on strike damage. With the mech being able to be set as fully automated, the engineer is free to build their character with all of their desired DPS skills by playing around with their weapon and utility skills. The Mechanist is currently dominating in every way, But as this is a live service game, and to remind everyone once again, there's always a possibility of changes and tweaks being applied in the future. And that wraps up Engineer. I'd say all 3 of its elite specs offer very straightforward and approachable DPS options, with a variety of playstyles, from the more complex to the more straightforward to the more fully automated with your mech. Moving on to the light armors, we'll begin with Elementalists. Elementalists, I would say, would probably focus on Weaver and Catalyst, but of course, Tempest has a few options to focus on condition damage and perhaps even strike damage. We'll start with the Weaver. Alonian Elementalists who weave 2 elements together, transforming the already complex class into an even more complex class. Weavers have a high damage output, but must master the rotation and remember that skills change when dipping into 2 elements at once. They also put themselves in danger by fighting in close-range melee combat. With the mastery of their sword, you have a few aspects of dodging and evading, but you're still up front and personal, making yourself a little bit more vulnerable. There are a few options at the Weaver's disposal alongside some of the evasion mechanics to increase survivability. These fall in line with traits and their stance utility skills. Some of these skills grant barrier and even increased evasive maneuvers. Weavers need to understand the encounter that they are walking into and adapt or devise a plan accordingly. Wielding a hammer, the Catalyst balances melee and mid-ranged combat. Catalysts charge up energy to summon a Jade Sphere to influence an area based on their attunement. These fighters are able to pulse out quickness to allies via a trait, but if you're looking for pure damage, you have other options of increasing your stats and granting yourself might. The Catalyst's playstyle is somewhat similar to the Weaver's, with swapping through your attunements, and also with their utility skills, which aren't labeled as stances, but function the same way through granting the Weaver special personal effects. Overall, Elementalist DPS options really put you in the front lines of combat with both Weaver and Catalyst. Here's hoping to a long-range elite specialization in the future. Necromancers. Necromancers also have great access to DPS roles through all of their elite specs, with Reaper, Scourge, and Harbinger. Reapers are great sword-wielding monsters with a very approachable damage playstyle. They play in melee combat with slower attacks that yield greater hits. Upon an enemy reaching 50% health, a Reaper's greatsword ability, Gravedigger, will automatically reset its cooldown on a successful hit. This allows this skill to be spammed, dealing out extreme damage, especially when it crits. They also gain shouts, which can often be woven into other attacks. The Reaper has an amazing trait called Reaper's Onslaught, which applies permanent quickness while they're not in Shroud. And at the time of writing this, they have a Grandmaster trait known as Deathly Chill, which, when you apply Chill, will apply bleeding. Now, I'm not here to tell anyone how to play, but I will point out that this trait is of an older era, when Reaper was more of a conditioned playstyle. When the time of writing this feels a little out of place, so I would probably caution you not to take that trait. If you're looking for condition damage playstyles, let's talk about the Scourge. With Scourges having access to a healing support role through its barrier application, Scourges can also specialize in a condition damage role. Summoning shades and using your profession skills will torment enemies around the summoned shades, and when traded, even burn them additionally. Scourges also wield the torch, granting them further access to torment and burning, and even a nice CC effect. Harbingers. The Harbinger fires tormenting and corrosive bullets with their new main hand pistol. Harbingers also excel at condition damage and granting offensive boons to allies. The Shroud is transformed into the Harbinger Shroud, improving mobility and granting spells that pelt enemies with conditions and crowd control effects. Harbingers are a very glass cannon-focused spec, as their health decreases as they build up their blight mechanic, but they gain improved damage at higher stacks of blight. Their Shroud also will no longer replace their health pool, so you might find yourself in a bit of a sticky situation if you're not too careful. But I'd say, overall, it's not that big of an issue. So for Necromancer, you have a nice melee strike damage build with Reaper, and with both Scourge and Harbinger, you have condition damage playstyles. Though with Harbinger, you also gain access to great amounts of offensive DPS boon sharing skills. Moving on to the Mesmer. Mesmers can also slot into any of the 3 specs they have: Chronomancer, Mirage, or Virtuoso. Chronomancers. In a similar theme to the Spellbreaker and the Untamed, the Chronomancer gains access to a more bruiser/tank playstyle, where self-defense is highlighted with their shield, along with modest damage options. There is a path to take in the Chronomancer trait line, which improves damage and allows the Mesmer to share out quickness to allies when they shatter their clones. The new mechanic of Continuum Split allows the Chronomancer to split into a separate timeline, granting them the access to cast their abilities in a short window and then return to the previous time period where all of their cooldowns originally began. Such a feature can allow for a high burst damage window, but can be a bit tricky to master with improper timing or improper clone usage. This is quite complex, but can be pretty fun. In the desert, Mesmers become Mirages. The Mirage focuses on condition damage through their axe weapon and augmenting the other weapon auto attacks through dodging. The mechanic of dodging is changed to Mirage Cloak. Using the dodge no longer interrupts actions or moves the player, and instead allows them to continue attacking while letting attacks pass through them. While in this state, the auto attack is transformed to a new attack based on the weapon you're using. Deception skills are the new spells available to the spec, and this is where more mobility can be equipped. Along with its trait lines being more straightforward, you can have a good time playing Mirage, honestly. And finally, we have Virtuoso. In Cantha, Virtuosos are masters of all forms of damage, both strike and condition. With a flurry of blades, with their profession mechanic, and also their dagger weapon, Virtuosos start off focusing on strike damage. But through trait choices of their bottom line, the daggers and blade skills can apply bleeding damage to shift the spec to a more Condi-oriented role. While the Virtuoso doesn't directly bring boon-sharing effects, the core Mesmer kit still brings plenty of utility for certain encounters. Virtuoso, much like Mirage, is very straightforward in its role and isn't looking to do too many things all at once, and for that, I love and appreciate it. And overall for Mesmer, you have a Chronomancer where it's a bit more tanky, but you get some more damage. Mirage, which is more so Condi, I would say, and allows you to have an interesting combat mechanic with your dodge being changed, and Virtuoso is perhaps the more approachable elite specialization if you're looking for a straight-up damage dealer. And that is the full breakdown of all of the elite specializations. For the most part, that can bring a very solid and straightforward damage DPS approach for any player out there looking to be that big damage dealer. Of course, there are countless ways that you can customize that specific elite specialization, bring different utility skills, take your 2 other specialization slots, could be whatever you wanted, but I thought this would be a nice starting point for people to perhaps get an evaluation of all of the specializations for each of the professions. Thank you all for coming on by. If you would like to catch my healer video, you can go and check that one out. Comment down below your thoughts about the damage, or if you have any tips for players of a particular elite spec or profession. And if you'd like to support the channel, head on over to Patreon, subscribe, comment, share, and if you'd like to purchase Guild Wars 2 or try for free, got links below. I'll see you all over on Twitch as well. Go give me a follow. I'll be over there streaming every day of the week usually, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye everyone. Mwah.